Thanks everybody for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks also for the nice introduction. I'm actually gonna kind of append some updates on what we've been up to with the Northeast Risk Management Network before I talk about the kind of specific research project of prioritizing range-shifting invasive plants. So the Northeast Risk Management Network is the RISC stands for Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change. And so what we're trying to do is to bring together these kind of two major global change challenges and understand what the implications of this, climate change is already impacting a lot of systems today and is going to, become a bigger and bigger problem moving forward, and the degree to which we can anticipate that and plan for it, the better off we're going to be in terms of, promoting the native ecosystems and native resources that we want to protect from both invasions and climate change. I've got across the bottom some of the support for this network. So you guys are familiar with the New York Invasive Species Research Institute. Northeast IPM Center is also funding our prioritization work, and the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center is funding some of the survey work that I'll talk about. So our leadership team, just so that you guys have some faces to put to names, I didn't put my own face on there, so I'll just remain incognito here. But the rest of my partners are Tony Lynn Morelli, who is a research ecologist with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, Carrie Brown-Lima, who you know at the New York Invasive Species Research Institute, and Jenica Allen, who's an assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire. So this presentation is sort of on behalf of our entire group. So we might ask why we're trying to add climate change to our plates, because we've got plenty to deal with already if we're just talking about invasive species. But the reason for doing this is because we know if we look at the invasion curve, I'm sure you've seen plenty of similar to this one, that if we can get to stopping invasive species at that really early stages, preventing their introduction or eradicating them at early stages of infestation, then that is a huge win in terms of, stopping those impacts on native ecosystems and stopping those big economic costs in terms of control and management later on. And so if we adding climate change to this question actually gives us this kind of new opportunity to say, species are going to be moving around, different species are going to be doing different things. And so it kind of sets us back to this prevention stage in many cases for these species that are likely to shift into New York or shift into the more northern climates. The kind of neat thing that we actually have is the ability to look to the south and say, oh, we actually know what that pool of species looks like, so we're not shooting completely blind. And so our goal with the Northeast Risk Management Network is to pose this question of how can we manage for upcoming biological invasions in the light of climate change. That's kind of our overall mission. So I just wanted to start by updating you on some various activities just associated with the Northeast Risk Management. Actually on the next slide, but also at the end here, I'll also chat you guys a link or the information for how to sign up for that listserv if you're interested in sort of, we don't have a huge amount of traffic, but every week or 2 weeks we'll get some updates on what's going on. So the first thing is that we have had symposia. I know that some of you have attended those at UMass in 2017 and 2018. This coming year, we're having a session, rather than having a standalone symposium, we're having a session within the NISMA meeting in September. So if hopefully many of you are planning to come to that, but when you do come to that, please keep an eye out for that special session on invasive species and climate change. Another activity that we're pretty active in doing is writing research summaries. So these are effectively where we go through the publications, looking specifically for papers that have been written about this, interactions between invasive species and climate change. And what we do is, we scientists are not always the best at writing for audiences beyond our small niches. And so what we at the RISC group do is to try to rewrite those summaries for a broader audience. And so if you're interested in receiving those, we're now doing them every other week. This at the bottom, our listserv information. And as I said, I'll chat that to you guys later on too. Another thing that we've been working on are what we're calling management challenge documents. So where the research summaries are basically summaries of single papers, the management challenges are essentially our take on emerging topics on the invasive species and climate change, and we're trying to synthesize all of the available literature. And so here are some snapshots of the 3 that we did last year. We're working on another one right now on range shifting native species, and we'll probably have 2, I would guess. We haven't figured out the topic for the second one later this year. But you can download all of these from our website, which I'm not sure if I even put that on the front page, but if you Google RISCC, you should be able to find us in the first couple of clicks. All 3 of these are posted on the website. So preparing for sleeper species, basically thinking about naturalized species that are not invasive currently, that could become invasive as temperatures warm. We have a specific one on warming waters and its implications for aquatic systems. And then we have one that is more targeted at a general audience of thinking about why for landowner or homeowners, planting native plants is beneficial to wildlife and also reduces risks of invasions. And then the last thing that we've been up to this last year and are currently kind of finishing up is a survey of priorities of the risk management community. So many of you guys may have participated in this last summer. So here are some of the preliminary results from it. So the first thing is that what we're seeing is that lack of information is indeed a barrier to including climate change in management actions. So what you're seeing on this graph is the gray bars are ones where if we pose the question of how do different factors limit your success to dealing with invasive species, the gray ones are just invasive species alone, and this is consistent with other studies where generally what managers are reporting is that it's lack of resources, so it's lack of funding, lack of personnel that is the biggest barrier, not necessarily lack of knowledge of what to do. But when we add climate change to that, when we say, okay, we want to now manage in a kind of climate smart way, dealing with invasive species, you can see that the red bars are kind of even across the board. So here we're dealing with actually not only the barriers of funding and personnel potentially, but also barriers of access to information and availability of information. So what we see, unfortunately, I wish we could provide more funding and personnel, but what we see the risk group's role is to trying to provide more of that access to information and availability of information so that at least we can reduce that potential barrier. So one thing that was kind of neat out of the survey respondents was that for folks who reported that they were more concerned about climate change, and to some degree, we see this, very concerned somewhat and not concerned as partly an educational issue, that the more we can inform folks about the upcoming challenges associated with climate change, the more concerned people tend to become. But the good part about this is that if you are more concerned about climate change, we're also seeing more people reporting that they're either sometimes, often, or always likely to be incorporating climate change into their thinking for invasive species management. And so what we want to see is lots of folks on the right side of this, often or always, incorporating climate change into their thinking. and the more that we're thinking about climate change, the more that we're incorporating climate change into our management plans and into our thinking. And we also already have what was pretty neat in terms of reports back out of the survey were these various different solutions that people said, hey, we're already doing some sort of climate change thinking in our invasive species management. And so this is part of a table that's just kind of cut and paste in here, but including things like, increasing our education, adding climate change to our strategic planning and thinking about, like what are the, what kinds of things might be changing with climate change that might further, affect our management plans, thinking across borders. So, outside of whether that's across prison borders or across state borders or across regional borders, talking to folks who are dealing with species that we expect to be coming, and ideally adding, there's always the spotted lanternfly kind of example that pops up, and this is a real issue that we need to address like immediately, but there are also plenty of species that aren't moving quite as fast and that are well known further south. So talking across borders, and then treatment and control. So thinking about, do we need to be treating earlier? Do we need to be treating things for a longer time period to deal with the changes in seasonality? And then last thing that we asked were research priorities. So this is the list of the things that we asked about. We definitely saw a lot of comments about differences in treatment too being a major research priority, that how treatment might change with climate change. But the top couple of ones that kept coming up were thinking about how we promote resilience or how we understand vulnerability to both of these global changes amongst our native communities, and then thinking about range shifting species. So can we look outside of our current ranges and anticipate what's coming next? And so that second one is what I want to focus on for the rest of the next 15 minutes or so, and talk about our original research on prioritizing range-shifting invasive plants, so addressing directly that question of risk assessments and hotspots. So I've got Massachusetts on here because I'm from Massachusetts, but the same kind of graphic on the right would be true for any state at this point. As climate is warming, our anticipation is that we're going to have new communities, whether that's native communities or invasive communities, that they're going to look very different moving forward into the rest of this century than they would have historically. So as temperatures are warming, what we anticipate is that species, including invasive species, respond to this by shifting their ranges. So this is one example of, I think water primrose is the common name for this particular plant. The black dots on here are all of the locations where this species is reported in EDMAPS, or at least was reported in EDMAPS in 2015. So these data might be a little bit out of date at this point. And based on those distribution data, the black points, the red on here is the current potential range. So if it can persist in aquatic systems in all of those black dots, then it's also likely that it can currently persist in aquatic systems in southern New York, for example. And then if you add climate change to that mix, within 30 years, we anticipate that this species could persist in aquatic systems across all of New York and into New England. So that's an example for one particular species, but we had, so this is work that Jenica Allen had led, created an analysis of almost 900 invasive plants to model range shifts. And one of the things that we see is that although the Southeast actually looks a little bit better, some of their invasive species might not be doing as well there. And this is just for plants. The Northeast and New York and the upper Midwest are definitely these hot spots where our current pool of invasive plants generally still hangs around, and we get this totally new pool of more warm adapted invasive plants. So we can use this, and Jenica has, to make watch lists, but the problem is, there are a lot of different species out there, right? So if we look on the invasive plant atlas, just the plants, we've got over 1,200 records of invasive species. So which of the, that's a really long list of ones that we want to try to deal with. And so that means that we need to somehow prioritize, right? So we can't control everything, all 1,200 species. We want to be controlling, ideally, the ones that would potentially follow this red dotted line, potentially become problematic and invasive and highly impactful. We don't want to spend a lot of our time working to do early detection and rapid response on the blue line if ultimately this species doesn't have a whole lot of impact and isn't really going to do much for the ecosystem. And so I mentioned this briefly a second ago. What we've done, or what Jenica really has done, is to use these range shift projections to generate watch lists for different states or different jurisdictions. So for example, sacred bamboo, on here, the blue is its current range. I'm sorry that the colors changed, but orange is still a future range projection. So this might be one that would show up as couldn't currently establish in New York, but in some regions of New York, it might establish given 2050 climate conditions. And so Jenica is currently working with EdMaps, with Chuck Bargeron at EdMaps, to see if they can integrate a watch list app with some of the, like the ability to look at maps and stuff like that for specific species on EdMaps, such that you could say, okay, for, the state of New Hampshire is the one that's in this particular example. I want to look for species that are within a given radius and ones that are going to show up within the next 50 years. Show me the list. So here, for example, is a list that we created a couple of years back for New York and New England. These are species that are not yet established, at least according to the EdMaps database as of a year or two ago. The ones on top are ones that could establish currently, but have not, and would then also expand their ranges by 2050. The ones on the bottom are ones that could not establish currently, but could by 2050. And this might even be an abbreviated list to fit on the slide. We ended up with 101 species. So again, 101 species is a lot to put on a list for people to look for, right? So, if I have this giant list of 101 things that I've never seen before, the odds of me actually finding any of them, especially when, they're relatively rare, are probably pretty low. So what we would like to be able to do is to take this kind of list and go back to this framework of identifying from that list of 101 species, what are the ones that are the red dashed line or the potential red dashed line versus what are the ones that are the potential blue dashed line, so that we can really focus on the red ones, the real wins in this case. So what we've been doing in order to do that is using an assessment called the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa, or ICAT, to prioritize those 101 species. And this is a project. This is led by actually an undergraduate at UMass. So she's been working on it for the last 2 years. She's graduating this semester with her honors thesis on this particular topic. So she has read titles and abstracts for all peer-reviewed papers for all of those species, which is a lot. We're talking about a couple of thousand papers that she's gone through. Then looked at the papers that measure impacts specifically so that we can focus and categorize the impacts. I will say that the benefit of this ICAT assessment is that it is very repeatable because it is specifically coming from the published peer-reviewed literature. It's also been adopted by the IUCN as their sort of, at this point, standard form for assessing impacts and comparing them across different invasive species. A number of European groups have taken this as their sort of like main tool for assessing things. So we felt like this was the best route to go in terms of a method for assessing impacts. And here's how it works. So we looked at ecological impacts, and ecological impacts get scored on a scale of 1 to 4. And we're looking only at plants here. So everything from minimal concern, so that is basically the paper says, you know, we saw this species, we measured whether there was a difference, and we didn't find any significant difference. So on whatever it was that we were measuring, or in this case, a study where a native spider behaved differently, but the population size didn't change. And those grade all the way up to a major concern. A major concern is where the invasive species has an impact that changes the composition of the native community. So really focusing on the ecological side. And then we have added to, so ICAT is specifically ecological, but we have added on to that in that we are also compiling papers that look at whether there is an agricultural impact, an economic impact, or a human health impact. And so here's an example of a summary that we created for that water primrose. So in this case, there were 11 total papers measuring impact using these different, so I didn't talk about the impact mechanisms, but that's another piece that ICAT does. It says, well, how is this impact happening? Is it because the plant is competing with another plant? Is it because, you know, it has toxins or it has allelopathy or something like that in terms of reducing the native community? Is it changing the fire regime or the chemistry? And that's how it affects things. So the impact mechanisms get scored individually. But a 4 on here basically means high impact. That's changing the characteristics of the native community. And then present at the bottom for agricultural, economic, and human health impacts suggests that this is a species that we'd like to avoid having up here. But depending on which species we look at, we see differences in the impacts. So for example, you know, the 2 on the top end up with a lot of 4s and present impacts for agricultural, economic, human health. The 2 on the bottom end up with mostly 1s and 2s and no or low impacts on agriculture, economic, and human health, even though we've got a number of papers to look at to see that yeah, we're not seeing a whole lot. Just in case you're interested, for the invasive plants specifically, we're seeing mainly that the impacts are coming as either competitive impacts, so just competing directly against native plant communities. We're also seeing mainly agricultural impacts, so those are kind of the 2 biggest things, but we're certainly also seeing changes to the physical community and allelopathic or poisoning effects too. So here is a draft, although this slide is a little bit old actually at this point. We're nearly at a final draft for this prioritized watch list. We ended up prioritizing it as if a species had 3 or more high impact, 3 or more scores of 4 on ecosystems, or health or economies, then we marked those as high priority. If they had fewer than those, then we marked them as medium or low. And we actually had quite a number of data deficient species, which we categorized as ones where there were 3 or fewer papers measuring impact. So our total population, we started with 101 species. We were only actually able to analyze 54 species that had at least 4 papers that we could draw information about impacts from. And of those 54, now I'm trying to remember how many actually showed up as high impact, but I think it's something like 18. So that's pretty good progress as far as starting from this watch list of 101 species and narrowing it down to 18 species. Feels like we're going in the right direction as far as being able to provide a list of, here, watch out for these 18 species. Maybe I could learn 18 species where 101 feels pretty challenging. Okay, so just as a conclusions on these, so what's kind of exciting to me about this combination of climate change and invasive species is that we actually have some insight into what's coming. And so we have this unique opportunity to prioritize and maybe proactively prevent these high-risk species from expanding into New York and New England. In order to do that, though, we need to have better coordinated efforts across borders. So New York's a lot bigger than the rest of the New England states, but in Massachusetts, we worry all the time about, okay, if we spend a bunch of effort trying to stop a species in Massachusetts, but Connecticut doesn't do anything, like that poses a problem for much of our state. And so in order to do that, and I know that this is something that the New York Invasive Species Research Institute is also working actively on, one of our next steps for RISC too is to try to start talking across borders and try to start thinking about expanding regional partnerships or recreating regional partnerships, because this, adding climate change to the invasive species problem really highlights the need for those coordinated efforts. Okay, so that's it for me. Thanks so much for your time, and I will hopefully be able to take questions and also chat the instructions for joining the RISC network.